Good evening, I'm Terry McCarthy. I'm the president of the Academy. I was sitting in my office before dinner, and some of you might have heard this. I was talking about it over dinner just before. There was this enormous peal of thunder. It came rolling across the Wannsee, and it felt very Wagnerian. It put me in a Wagnerian mind. I don't know how many of you like Wagner's music. I'm rather partial to it myself. But I thought it was not a bad theme for tonight. Maybe we can start with the Rheingold and Alberic giving up love to get his hand on the Rheingold, because that's what Rosalind's going to be talking about tonight. People who give up more than love, give up often their lives to get hold of gold in these mines in South Africa. Let me first welcome one of our trustees, Volker Schlendorf. Delighted to see you can make it tonight. Our speaker, Rosalind Morris, is Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University. And we're very excited. She's our inaugural fellow in a program set up by the Andrew Mellon Foundation for 3 years. And we'll be having a series of fellows. And we'll also be convening a seminar, first one in January. And there's going to be so that'll be private, but there will be one open event on January 7th. So please mark your calendars for that. We're going to be bringing people to talk about various themes. But Rosalind tonight is going to talk about gold miners living in very tough conditions, often months underground, in 10,000 kilometers of tunnels in South Africa. Extremely Wagnerian and extremely worthy to be discussed. Rosalind.
I have to summon my inner Valkyrie and throw a few thunderbolts, but before I start, I just want to say good evening and thank you all for coming. It's a real honor for me to have you in the audience, and I'm grateful for the time that you have been willing to devote to this evening. Before I say anything about my chosen topic this evening, I'd like to make just a few gestures, inevitably inadequate, to express my gratitude to the American Academy in Berlin. I mean, this is an environment of remarkable generosity, and the staff here have been amazingly supportive and enabling in every way. My fellow fellows have provided a community of intellectual engagement and solidarity that has transformed itself into friendship, a true and rare gift. And I'm especially indebted to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which made my stay here possible. I'd also like to thank a number of people in South Africa who have been particularly important for the work and ideas that I'm going to share with you this evening, and especially those whose words I'll be quoting. Prosper Mhlube, Bakani Mpande, Sarah Mpande, Fani Magwaze, Darren Menenge, and Cora Bailey. Many of the images that you'll see are the product of a film I'm directing, and I want to acknowledge my wonderful cinematographer, Ibrahim Haji, and my editor, Pascal Tremel. Thanks also to Yvette Christiansa, who is not here, but who has supported me throughout the 22 years that I have been trying to learn how to learn from the people of Southern Africa. So I'm going to speak about what will seem in many ways to be an exclusively South African story. But it's also a story about all of us, and not only because we wear rings and watches and necklaces made of gold, or because every cell phone has a tiny bit of the precious metal within it. I will start with an image. Then I'm going to show you several images, and sometimes I'll pause to let the video, as well as some video, and sometimes I'll pause to let the video run, and sometimes I will speak over it. And there are also dark screens here, so don't panic. It's not a technological glitch, I hope. That's also possible, but we will cross our fingers. The first image is an aerial shot of an informal settlement that abuts the ruins of what was once one of the world's largest and deepest gold mines. That mine, not far from Johannesburg, was established in 1897 by a group of financiers known as the Werner Byte Eckstein Group. Julius Werner was a Protestant mining engineer from Darmstadt, and he formed Werner Byte and Company with Alfred Byte, a German Jewish businessman from Hamburg who had started in real estate speculation before partnering with Cecil Rhodes in the diamond and gold industries. They created the Werner Byte Eckstein Group of companies after joining with the son of a Lutheran pastor named Hermann Eckstein, a financier from Hohenheim, who also made a fortune in the diamond mines with Rhodes. Eckstein would also be the first president of South Africa's Chamber of Mines, a monopoly organization created to ensure that finance houses never had to compete with each other via wages. All of these men would become British subjects, rewarded for their opposition to the Boers in what was then an autonomous republic, when it fell under British rule at the end of the Anglo-Boer War in 1902. We will come back to them. Look closely. In this image, we see a convivial social world whose relationships are traced in shadow. The shadow seems oriented in one direction, but in fact the bodies are oriented in another. A dog looks to someone who might be a master but appears turned toward two other men. The men's shadows loom large, extending far beyond their corporeal dimensions and giving proportions of grandeur. In other words, the shadows in this image reveal a certain distortion, and as such they can be read as figures for an ideological process, a misrepresentation which nonetheless bespeaks a certain truth about the world. Now, many of us carry within us images and fantasies of gold that are analogously distorted. Perhaps the most potent of these is the idea that because gold is deemed a secure and perduring store of value, gold mining is similarly stable. The promise of an endless source of wealth is disseminated in the halcyon glow of the corporate brochures that give us the image of spectacular industrial power set against nearly infinite horizons. But gold mining, like all mining, is an encounter with finitude. Mines become exhausted, they close. They close for reasons of mineralogical depletion or because of political decisions and in response to price volatilities. Sometimes, though rarely, they close in the aftermath of catastrophic events or in recognition of environmental risks. But insofar as they are not merely openings into the earth, but social worlds sutured together by desire, administrative power, and violence, they can also be said to die. What comes after this apparent death is ruin, but also afterlife. Freud called this condition Nachträglichkeit, and ruins, I want to say, are structures that shape existence in an infrastructural afterlife. So I've now introduced the first concept with which I would like us to think this evening. I use the term afterlife or Nachträglichkeit following Freud's example to designate a specific relationship to the past in which prior events continue to produce effects, but without being visible as their cause in any straightforward manner. In this afterlife, effects are deferred or belated, and they unfold in a time that seems discontinuous with that of conscious, everyday life. Sometimes they lead individuals to feel themselves to be uncannily inhabiting a time out of time, a time marked by the persistent but interruptive presence of the past. Now, the people about whom I shall speak tonight, informal miners called zamazamas, do not necessarily find the persisting presence of the past to be unnerving in all respects. Nor is it always felt to be symptomatic of traumatic experience. Many of them inhabit a cosmology that accords ancestral beings a real force in their lives. But they also often expressed a historical consciousness that is marked by the recurring effectivity of systems, of power, difference, and inequality, that ought to have been left behind when, in 1994, South Africa entered its democratic era. And in fact, the people who inhabit the ruins of the mines feel both left behind by democratic modernity and obstructed in their own relationship to pre-colonial forms of being. Much of what I will describe to you can appear to be a kind of throwback to forms of existence that preceded the advent of capital-intensive industrial mining. And for this reason, it is sometimes described as artisanal. Now, this term functions a lot in places where the gold mines were once, gold mining was undertaken on the surface in alluvial context. And what I'm going to show you is something very different. What I mean to address with the term Nachtragligkeit is the fact that after deep industrial mining, after the colonial dispossession and enforcement of migration to and from the mines, after the colonization of desire and the experience of consumer pleasures, there is no going back to older forms of being. Rather, everything that about the present takes place in a shadowed afterlife. Sol Plaatje, the great Swana writer and founder of what would become the African National Congress, captured this sensibility perfectly when he wrote in his novel, Moody, that there's always a return to ruins. Only to the womb is there no return. But before pursuing that idea, let us return to our images. Not the glowing scene of illuminated techno-power, but the devastated and toxified landscape in which a rusted piece of headgear stands above a tailings reclamation site. Next to it, in the foreground, on either side of the image, are the ruins of foundations. It may help to grasp their significance and the difference between the ruin as mere leftover and that which haunts the present as the specter of a betrayed future. If we recall, bear with me, Jacques Lacan's reading of Holbein's wonderful portrait of the ambassadors, painted in 1533 at the beginning of the mercantile era. Lacan noted that the strange stain in the foreground of the image, if seen from the corner of an eye in the act of turning away, reveals itself to be the anamorphic image of a skull. The painting thus inscribes death in the heart of Power's portrait. So let's go back to the headgear. Death is not a surreptitiously inserted figure in this image. It has proliferated and literalized itself in the form of ruins. It's all too visible. In fact, life is what is most invisible here, that which has to be seen in the shadows, as it were. And this is true of the migration phenomenon more generally, and perhaps especially in Europe, where it becomes most poignantly visible in the photographs of corpses arriving on the fatal shores of the Mediterranean coast. My hope in this evening's presentation, which concerns the lives of migrants whose itineraries are shaped and haunted by the long history of European colonial and apartheid extractivism, is that you will come to care about the people who are compelled to move but who have no claim on mobility. Before I get to that discussion and concluding, I want to show you that there is life in the ruins, even when it's hard to see and when our vision is distorted. So, now that we're in the land of illusions, let us consider those which haunt the discourse of gold. In the era of financialization, many people believe that money has become relatively abstract, lifting off from any referent in the real world. Futures and derivatives, currency speculation, debt swaps, and digital trading seem to imply the derealization of the monetary order. We have abandoned the gold standard. At best, it functions as a hedge, a relatively stable alternative to the equities market. And this is the joint financial wisdom of some economists and many cultural theorists. And yet a very significant portion of the world's people, and perhaps the majority, continue to act and live as though gold is still the stuff and standard of value. When Russia responded to new sanctions by dumping US dollars and investing in bullion, as it did a few months ago, it revealed to us the residual power of gold to represent real value. Now, this strange formula is a contradiction in terms, the true representation of real value. And even though all representations are abstractions, it was not always the case that gold could claim a privileged place as value's master signifier and as the relatively universal medium for accessing the plenitude of desire's objects. In the 1880s, at the time when European powers were gathering in Berlin, to carve up Africa and distribute it among themselves, thus inaugurating the era of extractivism, as they did here on Lake Banzi in 1884 and 1885, bimetallists in the United States were still convinced that a gold standard was a conspiracy of an international cabal. They were led by William Jennings Bryan, once deemed the orator of populism, is still a story about us. And in 1896, he addressed the Democratic National Convention with the siren song of silver in a speech referred to as the Cross of Gold. In the first novel of his trilogy about American national being, John Dos Passos quoted Bryan somewhat freely as saying, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." Now, Dos Passos' narrator could not foresee the end of wage labor in the mines, but he makes the connection, as many populists did, between the gold bugs, as they were called, and the mining engineers and landlords of South Africa. This is what he says. But MacArthur and Forrest, two Scotchmen in the Rand, had invented the cyanide process for extracting gold from ore. South Africa flooded the gold market. There was no need for a profit of silver. Indeed, the rise of the gold standard was partially enabled by new technologies that allowed South African mines to recover up to 90% of the metal from the ore, making payable what were otherwise low-grade and deeply buried gold reserves. On this basis, South Africa became the world's largest producer of gold, a rank it held for exactly 110 years after Bryan's speech, until 2006, when it lost that status to China. As I said, the gold mines of South Africa are closing. And by 2033, the Chamber of Mines estimates that gold mining using conventional methods will come to an end in that country. Production has declined radically over the last few decades, and although many South Africans still believe the industry is at the heart of the national economy, the number of directly employed individuals in the sector is only about 25%, about a quarter of what it was at its peak in 1988. There were 480,000 employees in the sector in the gold mines that year, compared to a mere 115,822 in 2016. Formally speaking, that is. And informal mining is another matter entirely. In the vacated spaces created by the closure of large-scale mining operations, which include vertical shafts more than 4 kilometers beneath the surface of the earth, and elaborate networks of tunnels that traverse many tens of kilometers, destitute migrants from the neighboring countries are making their way in search of residual gold. The formal mines once depended on capital-intensive and highly mechanized processes. After drilling, shafts are typically finished with reinforced cement. The tunnels underground are buttressed with supports bolted with flexible steel and various synthetic materials like resin and polyester. And the artificially cavernous spaces are illuminated by electric and battery-operated lights. You can hardly believe you're 4 kilometers beneath the surface here. The mining itself is aided by pneumatic drills and refined blasting technologies. Ore is transported using automotive removal equipment and electrified rail transport. The deep-level mines also make use of complex dewatering and oxygenation systems, as well as cyanide and mercury-based comminution processes and industrial smelting. Yet today, informal miners, as I said, called zama-zamas, most from Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and Mozambique, perform all these functions manually. They enter the earth with no more than picks, hammers, battery-operated headlamps, and on occasion rubber boots and protective clothing woven from jute sacks. They follow the same routes as industrial miners did, but without the assistance of electric transport vehicles, and in the absence of industrial oxygenation and dewatering.
Ino to the remote ji. Yeah. Dia kita ni. Dia. Nama. Betul. Ya, dia andira piti ni ya. Ya saya. Hey, mana aku nak? Right. Kita mesti jumpa dia special. Tawin kabuli mbugo, sibawe sasa kuku, usul.
Upon finding a potential vein in the rock, Zamazamas assay samples by panning and using sausage-sized sticks of dynamite purchased on an illicit market to blast rock that then they sort by hand and carry on their backs in bags that once held rice or cornmeal. Working in small groups of friends and relatives or as men from the same region who share a language, the men stay underground for days and weeks at a time. The groups are both work teams and protective units, their conviviality leavened by the need for self-defense in the event of attack by armed robbers or bandits underground or at the shaft exits. Above ground, women perform the Sisyphean labor of transforming rock into powder, breaking stones with other stones to produce a fine sand that can be mixed with water and then poured over ribbed towels on makeshift sluicing tables. This intensive manual labor takes over what was performed by enormous grinding machines when the industrial mines were in operation, as many still are. Nonetheless, the women make use of the remainders of that industrial process, using the smooth surfaces of the cement foundations where once mine offices or dwellings stood, to ensure the efficiency of their grinding and to mitigate the loss of material in the natural crevices and perturbations of the earth. The women are organized in teams under the possessive gaze of the men who have borne the rock and who temporarily claim both the women's labor and the territory as their own. Those same men gather the visible gold nuggets and flakes from the sluicing tables before consolidating and sifting the runoff, amalgamating it with mercury, and smelting it with handheld torches. The remainder constitutes the payment for the women's work.
As you could see, there were two buckets on the front there, when we were training. The sand which was falling inside the bucket is for the ladies which are crushing the stones.
Yeah, I was saying these are our leftovers, the soil which we get it from there, from these guys. So we're gonna refine it and then we get some money from it. This is how we get paid. Yeah, they don't pay us with money, they pay us with some leftover soil. Yeah, that's why you get some gold here. See?
Sorry, we've got a little lag time in there. I'm not quite sure why, but anyways. At the end of these gendered processes, tiny nuggets are sold into the market via local middlemen who keep track of spot prices on the international commodities market and pay in cash. Organized gangs play their part, but do not monopolize all of the production in this world. Whether sold independently or brokered by gangs, the gold will travel along the capillary networks that extend from Johannesburg to China and India and Dubai and Pakistan and the US and Europe. It will adorn the bodies of the wealthy and be incorporated into dowries and clad the feet and the fixtures of the ultra-rich. It will be used to hedge financial bets, to secure or repay loans, and also to signify a capacity for excess. In fact, the suspicions of the bimetallists and contemporary conspiracy theorists notwithstanding, most of the world's above-ground gold is not to be found in Federal Reserve banks, which accounts for only 18% of the total. Rather, it takes the form of jewelry. Though I'm not quite sure if that includes Ronaldo's boot or Catalan's toilet. Nonetheless, the anxieties about a relationship between power's concentration and the holding, if not hoarding, of gold bears some truth. To wit, the US, Germany, and the IMF account for more than 1/2 of all the world's bullion in reserve holdings. Zama-zamas would like a piece of that pie. And their desires arise at a point of convergence, a perfect storm of apparently opposed tendencies. These include the decline of formal mining on one hand and the rise of gold prices on the other. And you see there that exactly at the point where South Africa loses its place as #1 producer in the world, the price of gold skyrockets. Yet there is more to the story than this. While touring the now decrepit mine from which the images I am showing you came, an elder of the squatter settlement that now resides in its ruins pondered the fact that the closure of the mine coincided with the end of apartheid. These are his words. In a conversation you can see the lines that I want you to pay attention. There's still money in the mines. These mines were just closed when a black man came into power, freedom, and they closed. For the old man, and for many South Africans, mine closure is a symptom of white capital flight. But that's not the whole story. After more than 50 years of residence on the compound, the man A, quoted here, recalled with great bitterness that the mine management had regularly evicted residents for non-payment of rents and or indebtedness, and then dismantled the residential structures rather than have them occupied by squatters. Incendiary protests in opposition to such evictions led to the final abandonment of the mine's residually functioning spaces, though not the sealing of the shafts in 2007. But even before that, ethnic conflict in the last days of the apartheid era had provided an alibi for mine management's new labor recruitment strategies, and especially subcontracting. Mines had historically cultivated ethnic difference in and through the assignation of residential spaces and different skill sets to different ethnic groups. And these reified ethnic differences permitted the political conflict at the time, suffused the political conflict at the time, and especially that between the National Party government, often in alliance with the Zulu Inkatha Freedom Party, on one hand, and the African National Congress, supported by the National Union of Mine Workers, on the other. Afraid of nationalization, mine management sought to liberate itself from dependency on union labor. The central tenet of their new strategy was the idea that self-employment provides greater freedom than union work. The mines thus offered an existential promise in answer to what was then as now the clarion call of striking mine workers, namely, Tinafuna Lomali, we want the money. And freedom, including not only the freedom to work, but also to move and to not be moved, or indeed removed, was enormously appealing. It glittered as brightly as any gold. For this freedom, and they closed, reverberates across many registers. Now, freedom is most palpable in moments when it's obstructed, of course. So it's no wonder that the old man, whom I've already quoted, spoke so frequently about gates and fences, signposts, doorways, and guard boxes, of waiting for approvals, permissions, and permits. But often as we toured the ruined world, he indicated that we were moving through a passage, and when he did so, he narrated the connection of adjoining spaces and the movement between them. A gate is a boundary, a threshold, a line to be transgressed or crossed in a manner that testifies to one's right of entry. A passage, however, is a conduit, a space of movement, of connection and conveyance. These quotidian narratives, and there are many, many contemporary versions, are in this context graspable as expressions of the ways in which a logic of the border, as well as the desire for its traversal, inhabits people's consciousness. But that is because the logic is also a concrete form, incarnated in the infrastructural world, and not only at the entry point of nation states or on cartographic surfaces. Infrastructure is particular, however, and the particular infrastructure to which miners are subject is, I would like to suggest, perhaps improbably, go with me, grasped by analogy to the arcade. I'm thinking here of the arcades of the late 19th century Paris, analyzed for us by Walter Benjamin. Benjamin famously described the function of the arcade as a theater of display value in a consumerist, exchange-based economy. And he acknowledged that the nature of these spaces, with all their connecting edifices and labyrinths of shops, were analyzable in his own time, some 60 years after their heyday, precisely because they had fallen into a state of ruin. It was there, in the shadow of a former existence, that Benjamin saw the emergence of new social types, including the flaneur, the gambler, and the rag picker. Now, despite their subterranean darkness, their inaccessibility, their lack of opportunities for consumption, the gold mines of South Africa are, I suggest, precisely theaters of display value. The difference is that in them, the value that is placed on the altar of desire is technology itself. As we've seen, images of that technology adorn corporate brochures and reports and are central to nationalist historiography, soliciting viewers via a complex mediatic display which is at once more extended and more dispersed than the shop window. Unlike the arcades, however, which Benjamin saw as the mirror image of the catacombs beneath the Parisian surface, the mines combined the arcade and the catacomb in a single structure, achieving in architectural form what Holbein had to insert in his painting by means of anamorphosis. Now, I'm not saying Paris is Johannesburg. Although, if you look at photographs from 1906, you might think otherwise. And William Kentridge saw the parallel when he made his first animated drawing entitled Johannesburg, Second Greatest City in the World After Paris, and gave the name of Soho Eckstein to its protagonist, the mining capitalist who would also feature in the series of films beginning with mine. I want to be clear that I am arguing more than that the mines of South Africa provided the gold that was on display in the arcades, and that was sought by both its shoppers and its gamblers. If we want to really understand the utility of the analogy, with the arcades, it's to be found more properly in the simultaneous emergence of the gambler and the rag picker, figures that come together in the Zama-Zama, who, like the gambler, risks everything for gold, and who, like the rag picker or the scavenger, has learned how to find value in waste. Zama means to try in isiZulu and isiNdebele, and Zama-Zama means to keep on trying. It also means to gamble. The term acquired its current valence in 1994 when it was introduced as the name of a lottery game that featured daily draws of up to 25,000 rand on tickets that could be purchased for 2. Today it designates both the activity of informal mining and the miners themselves. Zama-Zama miners are gamblers, and they take both calculated and incalculable risks in the pursuit of gold and thus money. But they also believe that the risks they take constitute a form of labor that, if immeasurable in quantitative terms, nonetheless has a relative intensity. It's the relative intensity, rather than any abstract labor time, that permits them to compare themselves favorably with those who are heirs to luck rather than ancestral favors, and thus undeserving of their good fortune. What differentiates Zama-Zama mining from other games of chance is the certitude of outcomes. Either money or death, but never nothing. Zama-Zama is like gambling, I quote, but the better part of gambling. They say, if you go in the mine, you are sure that you may come up with something, maybe 200, maybe 300, maybe 100. The reason for this is quite simply that you will stay underground until gold is found. The fact that miners must pay entrance fee and exit fees to security guards that they themselves have appointed means that they cannot leave the shafts empty-handed. You go there to look for money, they say, but sometimes you can't find money. Not right away. So you have to sacrifice yourself, stay underground for 3, 4, 5 days until you get what you want. Please note that the word that's used here, I'll come back to this, is not gold. You don't look for gold, you look for money. The one who sacrifices himself in this way is, of course, hoping to avoid death. And yet he must risk it. If you're risky, take risks. At the end of the day, you'll get rich. The young man who says this in a conversation with his elder cousin invokes the figure of the soccer star Cristiano Ronaldo, he of the golden boot, to make his point. The eldest cousin sighs, half derisively, half admiringly. He can buy a small country, whereas some of us, we don't have enough to buy t-shirts. Now, miners often talk about what might happen if they strike it rich, and what they aspire to is often less the satisfaction of needs than the valorization of desire's apotheosis. So consider the following monologue. If I hit it big, I am going to park a car. Then I'm going to buy groceries. After that, I'm going dancing. That will be the end of my Christmas. Now, this statement elicited both approval and then ridicule from other men underground, and it initially confused me. Why would you park a car if you struck gold? Wouldn't the first thing be to buy a car, maybe a very fancy car? And often enough, these men talk about their poverty as being indexed by their lack of a car, of being dependent on their legs. In this land of automobility, in which cars and other vehicles have for decades provided the symbolic infrastructure within which racialization and class differentiation takes place, the car is an index of wealth and the medium of spatial and social mobility. So it's important that the young miner describes his hoped-for wealth in an image of parking and repose. Not speed or the thrilling velocity that violates the laws of the highway, not the rush of acceleration or the cinematic sequence of passing trees. The dream of a parked car is a dream of economy's transcendence. It's a picture of surfeit, a dialectical image of stasis achievable only after having entered and exited the world of movement, including the movement out of immobility, the immobility that poverty entails. The other men understood this, but they scoffed when the young man said he would buy groceries. "Why are you always talking about groceries?" sneered one. "I want money. I want everything." If, however, the miners derided the descent into practicalities, actual exchanges, and consumption of use values, their own dreams typically followed the same sequences. Only secondarily did they enumerate the purchases they would make, typically starting with new cell phones. Women, by contrast, this will probably not surprise many of you, tend to plan their expenditures in the opposite direction, beginning with necessities and only at the end, when all needs have been satisfied, dreaming of luxury consumption. For reasons of its almost unimaginable extravagance, Ronaldo's fabulous wealth beguiled the men from afar. The elder cousin of the duo I described here frequently invoked the soccer star as the emblematic personification of absolute wealth, and he sometimes speculated on what it would be like to occupy a place of such seemingly limitless means. "If I can be Cristiano, I can do mati, make a carpet of money. Even my blankets can be made of money." His conversation would then become a reverie about a world fabricated from money, of beds, tables, and chairs made out of stacks of cash. The literalization of the idiomatic metaphor, such a fabulous metaphor, provides for us the inverse image of that parked car in which the lucky man expresses his freedom from need as repose, rather than frenzied consumption. Here, money is not only that which buys the car or the bed, it is the carpet and the bed. And one is hard-pressed to imagine a more perfect expression of the fetish character of the money commodity, of its coming to appear identical with that which it buys. The image has banished from its body the memory of exchange, while disclosing a truth about money's capacity to transmogrify into absolutely anything. At the same time, it reveals gold's promise to ground that potential in the order of the real, to be the thing itself. The men knew what they were doing. They laughed with deep and self-satisfied irony as they slid between the idiom of walking on cash and the fanciful depiction of real blankets woven from paper currency. The laughter that erupts in this context is not unrelated to the thrill of gambling itself, as Freud well knew. He likened manic laughter to the kind of expenditure made by the poor wretch who, by winning some large sums of money, is suddenly relieved from chronic worry about his daily bread. Were the men dreaming of gold, or were their minds bedazzled by money? What does it mean, in any case, to speak of a raw gold rush when you are talking about those who are seeking to produce it? In his writings on money, Marx vacillates between a defense of gold as naturally predestined for its function as the medium and symbol of value, by virtue of its density, divisibility, permanence, and stable luster, and an analysis of it as a pure product of ideas. And he noted that as both a measure of value and a medium of exchange, it could easily be replaced by tokens or symbols. Indeed, it is by virtue of its separation into body and shadow, matter and sign, that the precious metal can serve as money. At the time of Marx's writing, gold had not yet been abandoned as the commodity anchor for national currencies, an event that would only happen in 1915 when Britain left the gold standard in what was assumed to be a temporary measure. And as we've already seen, bimetallism was opposed to gold's relative valorization as the signifier of general equivalence until the end of the 19th century. The two potentialities of gold as money, that it can be substituted for by tokens and that it can provide access to other valued objects, derive from the fact that in the end it is only a connecting link, a chain of infinite concatenations. Now, a slightly more poetic rendition of this theory can be found in one of Benjamin's favorite writers, Edouard Godin. I see it in terms of the joys which gold procures, and I savor them to the full. I live 100 lives in one. If it is a voyage, it is like that of an electric spark. If I keep my fist shut tight, and if I hold onto my banknotes, it's because I know the value of time too well to spend it like other men. To give myself to one pleasure alone would cause me to lose 1,000 others. Thus speaks the hoarder. But it is the capacity and the promise of unlimited access to everything that can be valued quantitatively that underwrites the fetishist's love of money, but not his love of gold as commodity. The fetishist of gold, who withdraws the metal from circulation to adorn his body, to plate the fixtures of his boudoir, to plate the soles of his shoes, that person sacrifices the lust of his flesh to the fetish of gold, and insofar as money is the representation of gold, which is also the representation of itself, including its function as money, this fetishization can take place with regard to banknotes too, as when a miner dreams of making a bed out of money. It's not incidental that these miners never speak of gold underground and rarely above ground, although in the English discourse that you saw there, which was addressed to me, that was the case. They always refer to the metal, even when it's embedded in the rock, or even when it's being smelted, as imali, money. And they see in it one of two great sources of freedom. The other is documents. So let me now turn to the last term of my paper this evening with the help of another image. Some of us spoke about this at dinner this evening. It's a drawing by William Kentridge, made on the pages of an accounts book for Rand Mines, which, as it happens, was a company in the Wernher-Beit-Eckstein complex that owned the mine of which I have been speaking this evening. And even today, old residents of the area say this mine was owned by the Germans. Although they cannot adduce the names, it is present in their unconscious as the trace of a history that caused them. Like all such registers, this one includes, among other things, entries for all of the wages of all of the workers who were employed in the mine when it was functioning. The pass numbers, you can't see this in this image unfortunately, but the pass numbers assigned to each of those workers by the labor recruiting organizations that serviced the Chamber of Mines can be read there. And as such, the register contains traces of the history of formal migrant labor in the colonial to become apartheid era. Now, the men and women of whom I have been speaking are also migrants. Most, as I said, are undocumented. Their itineraries follow those of migrant workers whose displacement and regulated, compelled seasonal movements were determined by the structure of the extractive economy in southern Africa, and it far exceeded the national terrain of South Africa, as it does today. Today, currency crisis in Zimbabwe, agricultural collapse, environmental degradation, and ethnocidal violence, as well as local corruption, compels movement anew. And the lure of gold substitutes for the promise of waged labor. If it is relatively easy to see what the afterlife of industrial mining looks like in the ruins, it is perhaps more difficult to recognize that illegalized migration is itself a mode of afterlife and also a kind of ruination. And yet it is necessary, I think, to undertake that imaginative leap, to think the border as an internal infrastructure of the psyche, one of thresholds and limits suffused with anxiety and fears of deportation, but it is also a structure of desire and hope. Some of that is captured by the praise song of the Chivenda-speaking Mbongi Chinanga Makadzi. She writes of the migrant's dream of crossing the border at Messina, where the video clip you just saw was made. I want to enter at Messina, land of copper where it looks as if the land rots, as if the stones are tarnished, where you find goldstone, and if you break it, even the man who never laughs, laughs. So there's that laughter again, that manic laughter of the gambler who is momentarily relieved from worrying about his daily bread, from thinking about groceries. And in truth, underground, there's a great deal of laughter and an incredible verbal wit and enormous pleasure, as well as listening to music and telling stories of homes and so forth. That I cannot show you this evening. But that laughter, that manic laughter, which expresses freedom, that freedom that would express itself in such laughter is for the Mbongi, as for the Zamazamas, also a freedom of movement and a freedom from being moved, of being evicted, displaced, held back, refused entry. For there is movement without mobility, just as there is stasis within mobility. Migrants do not necessarily have mobility, and those without documents are never immigrants. Mobility as an ethical concept and a normative principle entails a recognized capacity and a right to both move and to not be moved against one's will. It is one of the names of freedom. It's in pursuit of that freedom that so many people in southern Africa take their chances and gamble on finding gold in the ruins. And so I'm going to close now with a final clip, one last look at what the world appears to be, or what it looks like when you are forced to inhabit and be inhabited by this border.
I'm kind of very curious about the lives of these Zamazamas. Maybe you could just start explaining what was happening in that dark video. It looks like they were going down a slope at some personal peril. What was going on there?
So as I said, these are informal miners who practice in the structures that were once the site of deep industrial mining. So in the first clip I showed you there, you see guys who are they look like they're entering into a cave. Mm-hmm. And at some point they get to an opening which has a kind of geometrical shape. And they have broken into one of the many shafts and tunnels that is underground. So these guys, without oxygenation, without dewatering, with nothing more than the equipment that I showed you, they are sliding down those shafts kilometers deep, walking for miles, looking for an old pillar, an area that was perhaps not mined. They are hoping to find a vein of rock. They're very skilled at identifying possible veins of rock, which they will then blast. And they will sort and pan and break into carryable pieces. And then they will put those in sacks, which they will then carry to the surface and give to those women, who will grind it into a powder that is then goes through analogous processes to what would have been the case in industrial mines. But as I said, they are entirely manually done now. The reason I say this is not artisanal mining in the way that a lot of people speak about artisanal mining in other parts of the world is because it is so entirely shaped and determined by this deep industrial history. The women grind on surfaces that are flat, that were former foundations. Those deep tunnels are made by huge machines, bigger than this room, that would normally be drilling.
From what you've just said, there are at least 100 ways you could die.
People die
right
often.
There.
People die often.
No backup, no safety. Those shafts were meant to have machines taking people down. They weren't meant to be climbing down.
That's true.
If something goes wrong, there's no... what kind of mortality or...
The truth is there's no way to estimate that because there are no numbers about the numbers of people that are undertaking this activity. There are
they must
thousands.
Talk about it, right?
There are thousands. Oh, I have been present at the retrieval of corpses. It's a very regular event. Every couple of weeks someone dies. Sometimes many people die at once in a rock fall. There's one of the fellows that I've quoted here already said, you think you can trust a rock, but you can't trust a rock. And people misjudge, or they blast poorly, or, because there are also different teams. There are small groups that are working together, and so some group may feel that, there's a great old iron support beam that I could use for recycling. I'm going to take that instead. And then there's no support. Or someone lets off some dynamite, and they haven't been able to do the kinds of inspections you'd do in a formal mine.
It's interesting, you say they don't talk about finding gold, they talk about finding money. And of course when you say that, it's obvious because they don't wear gold. They sell it for groceries or whatever, right?
So of course they sell it. Of course their whole lives are made possible by this. You sell that gold and you can pay your rent. Right. You can buy clothes, you can buy groceries, all those things that people do. But it's not the case that they don't wear gold. And if you notice, one of the women who's grinding, she has a gold wedding band on. And in fact, one of the men that I quoted here has, I think he has a gold ring on every hand. I'm not sure it's real gold. But yeah, they're like people everywhere, They love the idea of having comforts. I mean, many of these people live in tin shacks smaller than the surface of this podium, that have no insulation, that have no electricity, that have no... But this doesn't mean that they aren't aware of and don't want those things.
And a lot of them are from Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi.
Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, Lesotho.
They've come into South Africa. Cape. The government has no problem with this? These people...
No, the government has a big problem with this.
Because it seems like the potential for human suffering is enormous. And
this is
bringing
true.
dynamite down into
This is absolutely true. These are all
shaft.
illegal activities. So, first of all, South Africa, all of these people from all of these countries have always moved to the mines and been forced to move to the mines, and many of them were displaced from their original homelands and then compelled to participate in the migrant economy. So, this isn't new. This kind of mining, of course, in 1996, the South African government recognized small-scale and informal mining and had an ambition to do what's done in a number of other countries, which is to license it, regulate it. But the kind of paradigm for that is basically alluvial mining, where you can license things and ensure that there's relative safety and so forth. But I mean, no one could ensure or take responsibility for that. So these people are, of course, illegalized in all sorts of ways. They are, however, there. And in many of the scenes in this film, there are police cars driving by. They come regularly to take bribes. Talk about that is part of a conversation underground all the time. There is a kind of relationship to these abandoned spaces which you could call a kind of securing of the perimeter. The state does not go there. If someone is murdered, if someone is injured, if a body needs to be retrieved, if a woman is raped, all these things happen very often. You won't get anyone to come and assist because there's a great deal of fear that surrounds this world, and partly there's a great deal of just misrepresentation. I mean, by and large, this is part of my project, these are ordinary, desperate people maddened by such poverty. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what kind of a crazy world do you come from? How bad must it be that seems like a reasonable way to survive? It's crazy. It's self-heroizing, it's all sorts of things, but the wreckage of so many of the environments, social and economic environments in that area makes it the case that this comes to seem reasonable. And there has become a kind of symbiosis. What's important to realize is that there are thousands of people in these communities, and although they are illegal, they are sustaining local economies. They pay rent in their squatter shacks that are on the property of formal title-bearing property owners. They buy things in grocery stores and kiosks, and they frankly keep much of that economy functioning because unemployment is so severe in South Africa. In these areas, it's, much above 25%, probably 50 or 60% in this area. So money is hard to come by. And anyone who can bring it into this world is not 100% undesirable. Even though there are waves of xenophobia and terrible violence, and even though the police can and do occasionally raid and deport these scenes.
So I come here from California, and of course in our great gold rush in 1848, years that followed, some people struck it rich, a lot didn't. And there's some evidence that most of the people who got wealthy were actually the merchants selling the prospectors their gear rather than the actual prospectors, but some did. I'm wondering, of the people, these Zama-Zamas that you spent time with, how many of them actually got that great nugget in the sky that took them out of their poverty and set them up for the car they could go to buy groceries with?
It's like the lottery, eh? I mean, nobody.
Nobody?
Nobody. But you make enough to live. 300,
so
something like 300, 400, 100, this big. If you consider that an ounce of gold right now is worth $1,200 US dollars, you don't need very much to make enough to live. A shack rental will cost you 500 Rand, which is about $40, I guess, right now. And you could make that and a little bit more. You could make 1,000 or 2,000 a month if you're persistent. Now Rand,
not dollars.
Rand, yes, Rand, right. But now the young man who you saw in that terrifying scene trying to cross those beams, shortly after I left, he struck it rich. And this was very exciting. And he managed to stay above ground for 2.5 months on 4,000 Rand. So what is that, like $350-ish?
From one nugget?
From one,
was it?
Well, from the result of the sluicing. So he made 4,000 Rand. Within 2.5, so he lived for 2.5 months. This tells you how little people actually like to go underground. He didn't go underground. He just carefully managed his money, stayed above ground. But 2.5 months later, he had great dreads, beautiful dreads. He had to cut his hair and sell it to pay for food. So striking it rich is a modest thing, but on the other hand, you can live, and there are, of course, stories, as with every lottery, $1.5 billion, right? There are stories of people who made 20,000 rand, and that is, for these people, a universe of money, but I haven't met anybody who's done that. And I've been there for a long time.
I'll open up to questions, but I'll ask you one last question. The people that go there, do they ever go back to the countries they came from with a stash, or are they basically permanent migrants?
So everybody here is sending money home, tiny bits of money, you know, even if it's just 100 rand. Everybody is sending money home to support families, to pay for the education. There are young people working in those mines in that form who are actually pursuing university degrees in Bulawayo and who can't afford to pay the debt that they incur, and so they come here to manage to get a little bit, slowly, year by year, to do that. But they do go home if they can. But it's a very dangerous thing if you are once, you know, it's difficult to cross out of your own home country if you have no documents. To cross back is even more difficult. And so this is something that people negotiate with great difficulty. Now, you saw a young man walking along a border there, along a barbed wire fence at Messina. Now he, in the long extended scene from which that comes, he jumped that border across the Limpopo River. This is a very common thing that people cross illegally. And right now there's not a drop of water in the Limpopo River, so it's not so hard. As you know, happens everywhere. There's also a formal crossing and people can go in and out. But going home is hugely important. And every single person that I know says that they would like to go home, even if only temporarily. But more than that, they wish to be buried at home. And this is, I think, a really important index. It's very common in Southern Africa and much of the world. And it's the first question I always ask people when I want to know, where do you think you're from, and where do you think you live now? Where would you like to be buried when you die? And when people say, no, I wish to have my body sent back to Bulawayo or back to Harare or back to the north of Zimbabwe, you know that they are migrants, but they have not really become immigrants in the way that we use that term. Their consciousness remains steeped in two worlds, and their hearts are in some ways directed back to a world that they wish would become survivable.
And they interacting with South Africans very much in those settlements, or is mostly just their own groups?
It's yes, it's, as I said, economically it's a very embedded world because there are so many different language groups in this world. Those people, for example, from northern Zimbabwe who speak Chitonga, as these men do, they will speak to others in Zulu or Ndebele probably. But there are some kind of thresholds that are harder to cross than others. And, you know, all of these people are multilingual. One of these young men asked me, he said, "Oh, Canada, it's bilingual." Or I had said Canada was bilingual, and he said, "Oh, what does that mean? How many national languages are there?" And I said, 2, proudly. And he says, "Only 2." But there's lots of interaction, and of course, as we know, people live next to each other, seem to be intimates, are friendly and collaborative, and then something happens, and there erupts from some deep place that line, that threshold that won't be crossed, and people reconsolidate their enmities too. But there's, at the informal level, there's mutual dependency that's recognized more than there's hostility.
Who has questions? You have a microphone. Joanna has the microphone. Lady right there.
Okay, so I make the start. Thank you very much for the, in a true sense, very rich presentation in terms of in how many areas. Of course, you could also tap into that. Of course, you're even more aware, but my mind is spinning in so many other questions, I guess. And to connect to 2 things you said, just now in the end, I think there's a connection, something that I was wondering about. In one of the many continuities that you also try, to work out from historical conditions to the now. One, I would like to ask you to talk a bit more about is the idea and the challenge of land. Of land that you talked about, from the carving up in 1884 Congo Conference, Berlin Congo Conference here, and the idea of that. A lot of political decision-making and the idea of dividing land and restructuring it is always seen a bit on the surface. And that has been done, of course, tremendously violently in South Africa as well, and also during colonial times and during apartheid times in terms of displacements, township building, and so on and so forth. And how this kind of continues underground, and what this makes to an idea of land and belonging in a way, to have this history that also, as you said very much in the beginning, wounds the land, also in environmental aspects, but also in a political way.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a big question. I probably can't respond adequately, but I think you've identified all the areas in which the politics of land have marked and marred the Southern African landscape, beginning with the drawing of national boundaries and then the creation of reservations. For the Land Act in 1913 really dispossessed the vast majority of native South African inhabitants and confined them on smaller and smaller and less viable agricultural and pseudo-agricultural terrains. And during the apartheid era, as I'm sure many of you know, there was established via the mines a system of mandatory but also absolutely temporary, transient movement, so that one couldn't, for example, have a pass that allowed one to stay in an urban area for more than, 6 months or 18 months or so and so at a time. But right now this is an incredibly tense area, a tense set of issues. There are various proposals, policies, and legal interventions that have been made over the last 20 years, which would seek to restitute some of the land that was expropriated from people. And it's, it was initially undertaken as a sort of willing buyer, willing seller was the idea, to transfer land that was in the hands of white owners, which were thought to have been the ancestral lands of other communities. It confronted a number of limitations. That is, who has title, on whose behalf is land claimed, is it a collective property, is it to become the personal property of local chiefs and so forth. But much of the struggle today is about how to think this question. And when I referred to that first image of the headgear as a devastated and toxified landscape, this is perhaps an inadequately spoken of part of the history of mining. Is there hasn't been good rehabilitation, and much of that land is really absolutely saturated with cyanide, with radioactive material. It's not like you could simply decide, well, now we're going to farm here. It simply wouldn't viable.
Superfund sites all across the U.S. as well. There's a
Not
big
as
pit
many.
in Butte, I remember.
Yeah.
It's still there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Butte, Montana.
Mm-hmm. I grew up next to what was the largest open pit lead and zinc mine in the world.
Mm.
So yes, they're everywhere. Trust me, there are very few places in the world where there are as many mines as close to the center of major urban metropolitan centers as in South Africa.
I'm sure that's right.
You walk across the street and you're in a schoolyard and you're in a shopping mall and it's extraordinary. And the landscape, of course, is also changing radically. As gold prices go up, the reclamation of the dumps is now a major area of investment, and this competes with the activities of some of these individuals. There's a lot of abrasion at the threshold between informal and formal activities at the level of the ownership, but at the level of individuals, no one seems to care. But driving through when I first went to Johannesburg, I used to find my way by saying, oh, there's a mine dump on the left at that corner, and they're not there anymore. You know, I'm always getting, there used to be a mine dump. So right now, the area that I've spoken about is the subject of a new licensing agreement which has given rights to an Australian mining company to start open cast mining right next to Rudaport, which is pretty astonishing.
And will that displace some of these Zamazamas?
Yes, I suspect it will. I think it'll displace everybody. I mean, a big open pit mine is a huge, scarring thing.
Who else has a question? Welcome.
You've been reading from your written project. You've been showing video. What is your main project? Is this video or is it print?
I'm doing
and
both.
How far are you, I mean, with both of them?
Well, let's say I've written a great deal about this in different forms, some in scholarly monographic style, some in essayistic form, some in collaborations with William Kentridge, some in different formats. I'm hoping, with the help of the American Academy in Berlin, to complete this book that's been gestating, let's say, for a good decade. I started this research in 1996, and much of my time was spent in the formal mines, and for the last 3 years I've been working in this informal area. And there's a film that is in final stages of post-production now. I mean, I see these things. I also do opera and other things. I see these just to show you how far my dilettantism can go.
So there's some Wagner there. Yeah.
See, there is Wagner there. I'm not singing,
good.
though.
The Rings.
And I will not
Rings.
write any notes that high. I see these forms as actually enabling each other, that one can express different kinds of things in different media, and what you can do with an attentive eye and a listening ear in one format. There's an installation version of this, which will appear here in Berlin in January, is one thing. What one wants to do in a more dilatory narrative form of film, that film hopefully will be out this year. And I suppose there are some people who would say choose. And I haven't done that. So.
Thank you.
Who else? There's a lady at the back. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the intriguing presentation. Really enjoyed it. I'm wondering about the mention you made regarding formalization, that the South African government has taken a few steps to try to formalize the informal mining.
Yeah.
Could you say a little more about what form it has taken, whether it targets this specific type of group who are mining in abandoned mines, or whether it has different targets?
Yes, in fact, in the last few weeks even, there's been quite a vociferous debate around this. There's actually, believe it or not, even these people who are undocumented are actually quite active in the demand for recognition and decriminalization. However, the Department of Mineral Resources stated very recently that although they are looking to formalize through licensing, which turns out to be quite expensive, to license small-scale and artisanal mining, they intend to do that for alluvial mining, and they have continued to use the term zamazamas for this rather than the ASM designation that's used for the other more recognizable forms. And they said, and you can understand why they say this, that they can't be in the position of licensing that which is essentially, and the expression was, sending people to their death. Because either you would rehabilitate these mines completely, and then they would be functioning mines, but the cost is extraordinary, or you seal them off, and that's what's happening instead. There are efforts to seal it off, pouring cement down the surfaces of the top shafts and so forth. Unfortunately, that's led to more accidents, not fewer. But my sense is that there's some movement towards licensing and formalization for those people who are involved in more surface level activities, where some reasonable standards of safety could be sustained. Not that I think necessarily that the DMR is entirely compelled by the concern for miner safety. But there is a reason to that position. As for this kind of activity, I mean, you can't wish it to go on, and yet I cannot wish for these people to be further excluded. So it's a terrible catch-22, a double bind of a very deep sort.
We got one last question. We're coming up on 9 o'clock. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes, thank you also from my side. Just one small question. Continuity, you've drawn a lot of kind of, how can I say, oh, you can say it better, but you've looked at kind of Europe and Paris and then now South Africa now. But do you draw in your work also continuity in terms of mining that occurred, you know, at the beginning of last century and the conditions? I mean, because you make this distinction between the Zamazamas and the miners in industrial mining, but also the miners in industrial mining, you know, have gone through a lot of hardship and have actually gone through similar processes, or do you see it very distinct?
Yeah, I mean, there are excellent histories of the early mining industry in South Africa. Really, I mean, some of the finest scholarship on mining comes out of that great tradition, and especially the Wits History Workshop. I mean, my particular focus is really what's happened since the end of apartheid. And so I spent a great deal of time, for example, in the areas in Merafong, around in Carltonville, Kutsong, Kokosi, Folkville, and so forth, where all the world's biggest and deepest gold mines are. And that's still a formally active area. And it became a very interesting place. I guess I should probably just say that I'm interested in mining, but I'm also interested in what is often excluded in the histories, the social histories of mining, which starts with the fundamental recognition that the vast majority who live in these places don't mine. They don't go underground. They are wives and children and bankers and school teachers and salespeople and mechanics and so I've been interested to tell the story of that complex web of social life, and so that, like, the actual history of deep industrial mining or so forth. I rely, of course, on the work of people who have studied earlier eras, but I've been very concerned with what's happened really since the beginning of the end, you could say, of South Africa's place in the gold industry, including, the struggles over organized labor, the conflict between the National Union of Mine Workers and the emergent association of AMCU, of Miners and Construction Union, and so forth. I mean, one can actually write the history of a whole world there. These were the places where the first strikes against the post-apartheid government took place, the first electoral boycotts, where the epidemic of the AIDS, the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic was located, and where, nonetheless, I think, and I really would like to testify to this, people have done an extraordinary job of transforming themselves. And this is what first drew me to this world, that creative and committed labor people are willing to undertake to change themselves. I mean, those worlds don't look like what they did 25 years ago. And not always in good ways, but not always in bad ones either.
Notes from Underground. Rosalind, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fascinating evening. Thank you all for coming.